You must suppose, then, that there are these two powers of which we've spoken, and that one of them is supreme over everything in the intelligible world, the other over everything in the visible. I wouldn't say in the physical universe, or you'd think that I'm playing with my words. At any rate, you understand there are these two orders of things, the visible and the intelligible. Yes, I understand. Well, take a line, divided into two unequal parts, corresponding to the visible and the intelligible worlds, and then divide the two parts again in the same ratio, to represent degrees of clarity and obscurity. In the visible world, one section stands for images, and by images, I mean first shadows, and then reflections in water and other close-grained, polished surfaces, and all that sort of thing, if you understand me. I understand. Let the other section stand for objects which are the originals of those images, animals, plants, and manufactured objects of all kinds. Very well. Would you be prepared to admit that those sections differ in their degrees of truth, and that the relation of image to original is the same as that of opinion to knowledge? I would. Then consider next how the intelligible part of the line is to be divided. In one section, the mind uses the originals of the visible world in their turn as images, and has to base its inquiries on assumptions, and proceed from them to its conclusions, instead of going back to first principles. In the other, it proceeds from assumption back to a self-sufficient first principle, making no use of the images employed in the other section, but pursuing its inquiry solely by means of forms. I don't quite understand. I will try again, and what I have just said will help you to understand. I think you know that students of geometry and similar forms of reasoning begin by taking for granted odd and even numbers, geometrical figures, and the three kinds of angle, and other kindred data in their various subjects. These they regard as known, and they treat as basic assumptions which it is quite unnecessary to explain either to themselves or to anyone else because they are so self-evident. Starting from them, they proceed through a series of consistent steps to the propositions which they set out to examine. Why, yes, I know that. You know, too, that they make use of and they reason about visible figures, though they are not really thinking about the figures at all, but about the originals which they represent. They are arguing not about the square or the diagonal that they have just drawn, but about the absolute square or diagonal, or whatever the figure may be. The figures that they draw or model, which again have their shadows and reflections in water, they treat as illustrations only, the real subjects of their investigations being invisible except to the eye of the mind. That is quite true. This sort of reality I then describe as intelligible, but said that the mind was forced to use assumptions in investigating it, and because it was unable to ascend from those assumptions to a first principle, it used as illustrations, objects which in turn have their images on a lower plane, in comparison with which they are themselves thought to have a superior clarity and value. I understand, he said. You are referring to what happens in geometry and kindred sciences. Then, when I speak of the other section of the intelligible part of the line, you will understand that I mean that which reason apprehends directly by the power of pure thought. It treats assumptions not as principles, but as assumptions in the true sense, that is, as starting points and steps in the ascent to the universal self-sufficient first principle. When it has reached that principle, it can again descend, by keeping to the consequences that follow from it, to a final conclusion. The whole procedure involves nothing in the sensible world, but it deals throughout with forms and finishes with forms. I understand, he said, though not entirely, because what you describe sounds like a long job. But you want to distinguish the section of intelligible reality, which is studied by the activity of pure thought as having a greater clarity and certainty than the section studied by the mathematical sciences, which in these sciences, assumption serves as principles, and their subject matter must be reasoned about, not directly perceived. And because they proceed from their assumptions and not to a first principle, they can never finally understand their subject matter, though it could be understood with the help of a first principle. And I think that you call that state of mind of geometers and the like reason, but not intelligence, meaning by reason something midway between opinion and intelligence. You have understood me well enough, and you may assume that there are, corresponding to the 4 sections of the line, 4 states of mind. To the top section, intelligence, to the second, reason, to the third, opinion, and to the fourth, illusion. And you may arrange them thus in a scale, and assume that they have different degrees of clarity, corresponding to the degree of truth and reality possessed by their subject matter. There's the illustration of the divided line. He makes no mention of the golden ratio, phi or phi, big phi, little phi, at least not in the translation, but I suspect in the original Greek that there was some wordplay to that effect. Here are the notes from the translator. Who was that? Rouse? H.D.P. Lee, the Penguin Classics edition, of course. His notes. The analogy of the divided line is, Plato makes clear, a sequel to the sun simile, its purpose being to illustrate further the relation between the 2 orders of reality with which the sun simile dealt. But it does so from a particular point of view, that of the methods or the states of mind by which we apprehend these 2 orders or worlds. The purpose of the line, therefore, is not primarily to give a classification of objects. It is made quite clear that both of the 2 methods of apprehending the intelligible world deal with the same kind of object, the form, though each deals with them in a different way. And similarly, though in the physical world there is a difference between physical things and their shadows, that difference is used primarily to illustrate degrees of truth. For we know very little about a thing if our knowledge is confined to mere shadows or images of it. The simile may be set out thus in the table. Broadly speaking, the mental operations or states comprised by the 4 subdivisions are A. Intelligence, that is, pure philosophy, leading to the vision of ultimate truth. Plato calls this, among other things, the dialectic, a term which modern associations are quite misleading in interpreting the Republic. Section B. Reason. Reason is the procedure of mathematics, purely deductive and uncritical of their base assumptions. Section C. Belief. Belief is common sense beliefs on matters both moral and physical. Ordinary opinions are a fair practical guide to life, but they've not been fully fleshed out. Later on in the Timaeus, Plato includes the natural sciences as well in this subsection, as they can never really reach ultimate truth because they're concerned with a changeable, measurable world. And D. Illusion. Shadows and all the various forms of illusions, second-hand impressions and opinions, by which the lives of ordinary people daily are beset. In this section, illusion merely appears as the apprehension of shadows and reflections, but the wider interpretation is demanded by the cave simile, which elaborates in a more graphic form the classification set out in the line. And it is also later implied in Book 10 that all works of poetry, art, and otherwise are as well to be included in this subsection. A is to B as C is to D. Phi is to 1 as 1 is to 1 over phi. Knowledge is to opinion as the intelligible world is to the physical world, as pure thought or dialectic intelligence is to mathematical reasoning, as belief is to illusion.